The Washington County Archives maintains its military service records in a brick building on West Main Street in Johnson City, where metal filing cabinets preserve documentation of every local resident who served in American armed forces from the Revolutionary War forward, creating a comprehensive archive of East Tennessee's contributions to national defense across 2.5 centuries of warfare and military engagement. A genealogist named David Patterson discovered an impossible contradiction in those records during the autumn of 2020 while researching his family's military history, finding his grandfather's older brother, Private First Class Samuel Lewis Patterson, buried in Johnson City's Mountain Home National Cemetery with a government-issued headstone identifying him as a World War II veteran who died in 1944, finding a carefully preserved uniform in his grandmother's attic, complete with campaign ribbons and unit insignia, suggesting service in the European theater, yet discovering that no Samuel Lewis Patterson appeared in any official military service records, that the National Personnel Records Center had no file documenting his enlistment or service, that the Veterans Administration had never processed benefits claims related to his death, and that the Department of Defense maintained no documentation indicating that anyone with that name from Washington County, Tennessee, had ever served in the United States Army during World War II, or any other period. The grave existed with its precisely carved dates and military designation. The uniform remained preserved with its distinctive patches, indicating assignment to the 92nd Infantry Division. Multiple family members retained memories of Samuel leaving for military service in 1943, and of receiving notification of his death in European combat the following year. Yet the official apparatus that documented American military service contained no trace of his existence as a soldier, despite the physical evidence and living memory suggesting he had worn his country's uniform and had died in its service during the largest war in human history. The absence of military records for someone with a government headstone in a national cemetery would be extraordinary under any circumstances, but became impossible when David discovered that Samuel's grave sat in a section of Mountain Home specifically designated for World War II casualties, surrounded by hundreds of other markers documenting men who had died in European and Pacific combat, their graves arranged in precise military rows that spoke to the bureaucratic thoroughness with which the Department of Defense tracked its war dead and ensured they received appropriate burial honors. The cemetery's own records showed Samuel Lewis Patterson being interred in January 1945, with documentation indicating his remains had been returned from Europe, along with thousands of other American soldiers whose bodies were repatriated after the war's end, suggesting official military involvement in his burial that should have required and generated extensive documentation about his service, death, and the processes through which his remains were identified and returned to his family for burial in his home community. Yet when David requested the military file that should have accompanied such a burial, cemetery administrators acknowledged that while their records confirmed the interment and showed it had been processed through official military channels, they had no service documentation and no death certificate, only the burial authorization itself, which listed Samuel Patterson as a deceased veteran entitled to government headstone and national cemetery burial, without providing the supporting evidence that typically justified such determination. The mystery deepened when David examined the uniform that his grandmother had preserved in her attic for more than 7 decades, finding it to be an authentic Army-issue service dress uniform from the World War II period with appropriate insignia, indicating enlisted rank and assignment to the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the Army's segregated African-American units that had fought in the Italian campaign during 1944 and 1945, suffering heavy casualties while proving that black soldiers could perform with distinction in combat, despite the racist assumptions that had led military leadership to question whether African Americans possessed the courage and discipline necessary for effective military service. The uniform's presence in the Patterson family's possession suggested Samuel had indeed served in the 92nd Division, yet the official unit rosters that documented every man assigned to the division contained no entry for Samuel Lewis Patterson, leaving David to puzzle over how his great-uncle could have worn a division's uniform, could have family members who remembered him serving with that unit, could have been buried with military honors suggesting official recognition of his service, yet could be completely absent from the meticulous personnel records that the Army maintained about one of its most scrutinized divisions during a war, when documentation of African American military performance carried significant political implications for ongoing debates about segregation and racial equality. Subscribe now because the investigation we're presenting reveals that this impossible soldier was part of a hidden system where African American volunteers, whose service might have generated claims for equal treatment, were systematically excluded from official military documentation, allowing the government to benefit from black sacrifice during wartime, while denying veterans the recognition and benefits that might have challenged segregation's foundations in the decades after the war ended. Johnson City occupies the Appalachian valleys where tributaries flow toward the Watauga River in the mountainous terrain of northeastern Tennessee, creating a city whose geography and history have been shaped by isolation from the main corridors of Southern development and by a population that included substantial numbers of white residents whose Unionist sympathies during the Civil War created different racial dynamics than prevailed in Middle and West Tennessee, where plantation agriculture and slavery had dominated the antebellum economy. The downtown district spreads across relatively flat land along Buffalo Creek, where railroad connections established during the late 19th century transformed a collection of small settlements into a regional hub serving the surrounding mountain communities with commerce and services that couldn't be provided in more remote locations. The city maintains complicated relationships with its past, celebrating its role as a center of East Tennessee Unionism and its contributions to American wars across multiple generations, while remaining considerably less forthcoming about the sophisticated systems of racial discrimination that operated even in communities without large African American populations, about the violence that white residents deployed to maintain racial hierarchies despite the region's supposed progressive reputation compared to the plantation South, and about the systematic efforts to erase black contributions to the community's development and to national defense during periods when acknowledging those contributions might have generated claims for equal treatment that white power structures were determined to resist. World War II represented a transformative period for African Americans across the United States, with military service providing opportunities for men who had lived under Jim Crow's restrictions to demonstrate capabilities and claim status that challenged the ideological foundations of segregation, creating pressures for social change that would eventually contribute to the civil rights movement, but that generated enormous anxiety among white supremacists who recognized that black veterans who had fought for democracy abroad would likely demand democratic rights at home, and who worked systematically to limit how much credit and recognition African American service members received for their wartime contributions. The military itself remained strictly segregated throughout the war, despite pressure from civil rights organizations, and despite the obvious contradictions between fighting fascism abroad while maintaining racial hierarchies at home, with African American units commanded by white officers who often held deeply racist views about black capabilities and who approached their assignments as burdens rather than as opportunities to develop soldiers who might perform with distinction if given adequate training and support. The 92nd Infantry Division embodied these contradictions, consisting of African American enlisted men and junior officers, led by white senior commanders who doubted their unit's combat effectiveness and who sometimes seemed more concerned with containing black aspirations than with achieving military objectives. The division's service in Italy from 1944 through the war's end in 1945 generated intense controversy, with some white commanders citing operational failures as evidence that African Americans couldn't perform effectively in combat, while others recognized that inadequate training, poor leadership, and the psychological burden of fighting while knowing their own country denied them basic rights had undermined unit performance in ways that had nothing to do with inherent racial capabilities and everything to do with how the Army had approached building and leading segregated black units. The debates about the 92nd Division's combat record carried enormous political significance because they would shape post-war discussions about whether military integration was advisable and whether African American veterans deserved the full range of benefits and recognition that white veterans would receive, creating incentives for military authorities to either minimize black contributions if they wanted to preserve segregation, or to honestly acknowledge African American military performance if they believed integration would improve overall military effectiveness. The stakes of this documentation meant that personnel records for the 92nd Division should have been particularly comprehensive and carefully maintained, making the absence of any record of Samuel Lewis Patterson's service even more inexplicable, given the political attention that the division's operations attracted, and given the bureaucratic thoroughness that typically characterized military record-keeping during a war that mobilized millions of Americans and that required tracking enormous numbers of personnel across global theaters of operation. David's investigation into Samuel Patterson's supposed military service began with examining family documents and oral histories that might provide clues about when and how he had enlisted, what training he received, where he served during his time in uniform, discovering that his grandmother retained remarkably clear memories of Samuel leaving Johnson City in spring 1943 to report for basic training, of receiving occasional letters during the following year describing military life and eventual deployment to Italy, and of the devastating notification in late 1944 that he had been killed in combat, though she could no longer locate the actual letters or the official death notification that should have been preserved along with the uniform and other memorabilia she had maintained across the decades since his death. Her memories described Samuel as proud to serve despite the indignities of military segregation, believing that African American military performance during the war would help advance civil rights causes and would demonstrate black patriotism and capability in ways that might undermine segregationist arguments about racial difference and black unfitness for equal citizenship, motivations that aligned with how many African American volunteers had approached military service during World War II as simultaneously patriotic duty and political statement about their right to full inclusion in American democracy. The family narrative about Samuel's service and death appeared entirely plausible and matched the experiences of thousands of other African American soldiers who had served in segregated units during World War II. Yet the complete absence of official documentation raised questions about whether the story accurately described what had actually happened, or whether family memory had constructed a version of events that differed in important ways from Samuel's actual experiences during the war years, perhaps reflecting what the family wanted to believe about his service, rather than what official records would have shown if they existed and could be examined. This possibility became more troubling when David interviewed elderly relatives who had known Samuel before the war, finding that several people recalled him leaving Johnson City in 1943, but couldn't provide specific details about where he had gone for training or how the family had maintained contact with him during his time away, with their memories containing the kind of vagueness that suggested either the passage of time had eroded specific recollections or that the family had never actually received regular communication from Samuel during the period when they believed he was serving in the military overseas. The question of how Samuel Patterson had obtained the 92nd Infantry Division uniform that remained preserved in the family's attic became central to understanding what had actually happened during the years when he was supposedly serving in the Army, leading David to examine the uniform itself more closely for clues about its provenance and authenticity, discovering that while it was indeed a genuine World War II Army uniform with appropriate insignia, several details suggested it might not have been originally issued to Samuel, or might have been assembled from different sources, rather than representing the complete uniform of a single soldier who had served continuously in one unit. The jacket's insignia showed the 92nd Division patch properly placed, but the size stamp inside indicated it had been manufactured for someone considerably taller than Samuel had been according to family descriptions and photographs, suggesting he either wore an ill-fitting uniform or that this particular jacket hadn't actually been his service uniform, but rather had been acquired after the war for preservation purposes, perhaps to provide physical evidence of service that oral tradition claimed, but that official documentation didn't support. The uniform's campaign ribbons presented similar anomalies, including decorations for service in the European theater and for participation in the Italian campaign, appropriate for someone who had served with the 92nd Division during 1944 and 1945, but arranged in ways that didn't match Army regulations for how ribbons should be ordered and displayed, suggesting either that Samuel had attached them incorrectly or that someone unfamiliar with military protocol had added the ribbons after the war based on what family members believed he should have earned, rather than on what he had actually been awarded. The combination of correct unit insignia with incorrect uniform sizing and improper ribbon placement created a pattern where the uniform appeared simultaneously authentic and fabricated, as if someone had carefully assembled physical evidence to support family narratives about Samuel's service, while making small errors that revealed the evidence had been constructed rather than simply preserved from an actual soldier's wartime experiences. David's examination of Samuel Patterson's burial in Mountain Home National Cemetery led him to investigate how the interment had actually been arranged and what documentation had been required to authorize burial in a facility specifically designated for veterans whose service entitled them to this particular honor. Discovering that cemetery records from January 1945 showed the burial being processed through official military channels with appropriate authorization from the War Department, yet the specific documentation that should have accompanied such authorization was missing from cemetery files that otherwise maintained remarkably comprehensive records about every interment during the war years, when thousands of casualties were being buried at Mountain Home and other national cemeteries across the country. The cemetery superintendent acknowledged that the absence of supporting documentation was unusual, but suggested that wartime chaos and the enormous volume of casualties being processed during late 1944 and early 1945 might have resulted in some paperwork being lost or filed incorrectly, in ways that would be difficult to reconstruct 7 decades later. This explanation would have been more convincing if Samuel Patterson's burial had been the only one at Mountain Home with missing documentation, but David discovered that the cemetery contained at least 17 other graves from the World War II period that showed similar patterns of official military burial authorization, without corresponding service records, personnel files, or death certificates that would normally accompany interments of war casualties in national cemeteries. All 17 of the other questionable burials involved African American soldiers, their headstones identifying them as members of various segregated units including the 92nd Infantry Division, the 93rd Infantry Division, and segregated support units that had served in both European and Pacific theaters, suggesting a pattern where black soldiers' burials might have been processed differently from white casualties, in ways that created gaps in documentation that wouldn't exist for white service. Members whose records were maintained with greater care and institutional attention. The clustering of undocumented burials among African American soldiers raised disturbing possibilities about whether the military had deliberately maintained incomplete records for black service members, either to limit their ability to claim veterans' benefits after the war, or to minimize official documentation of African American military contributions that might be used to support arguments for integration and equal treatment during the post-war period when segregation faced increasing challenges from civil rights organizations and from African American veterans who had demonstrated their capability and patriotism through wartime service. The systematic nature of the documentation gap suggested intentional policy rather than random bureaucratic failure, indicating that someone in the military record system had made decisions about which soldiers would receive comprehensive documentation and which would be processed in ways that minimized their presence in official archives, despite their service and sacrifice being recognized through military burials that acknowledged them as veterans entitled to honors that the government otherwise seemed determined to deny them through the absence of records that would support benefits claims or that would document their contributions to the war effort. David's investigation revealed that the National Personnel Records Center, which maintained military service files for all American service members from World War I forward, had experienced a catastrophic fire in 1973 that destroyed approximately 18 million personnel records, including files for many World War II veterans, creating a plausible explanation for why Samuel Patterson's service documentation might not exist in the Central Archives where it should have been preserved if he had served in the military during the 1940s. This explanation initially seemed to resolve the mystery of the missing records, suggesting that evidence of Samuel's service had simply been destroyed in the fire, along with millions of other files, leaving only the physical evidence of his grave and uniform to document military service that official records could no longer confirm or detail, because the fire had eliminated the primary source of information about his wartime experiences and the circumstances of his death in European combat. The fire explanation became less convincing when David learned that the 1973 disaster had primarily affected Army and Air Force personnel records for individuals whose last names began with certain letters, with the destruction following alphabetical patterns that meant some veterans' files were completely lost, while others survived intact in sections of the record center that the fire hadn't reached. and that Patterson fell within the alphabetical range where substantial numbers of records had survived, rather than being destroyed, suggesting that if Samuel's file had ever existed in the record center, it should still be there, unless it had been removed before the fire or had never been filed in the first place. The record center maintained detailed documentation about which files had been lost in the fire and which had survived, allowing researchers to determine whether missing documentation reflected fire damage or whether records had never been created or had been deliberately removed from the archives for reasons that the center's bureaucratic procedures didn't capture or explain. When David formally requested information about whether Samuel Patterson's file had been among those destroyed in the 1973 fire, the Records Center responded that they had no evidence any file for someone with that name and service dates had ever existed in their holdings, meaning that either the records had been destroyed so completely that no trace remained of their having been there, or alternatively, that Samuel's military service had never been documented in the personnel files that should have been created automatically when he enlisted, and that should have been updated throughout his time in uniform and following his death in combat. The distinction mattered because fire damage would suggest that evidence of Samuel's service had existed but had been lost to historical accident, while the complete absence of any record that files had ever been created would indicate more troubling possibilities about whether Samuel had actually served in official military capacity or whether his wartime experiences existed outside the normal documentation systems that tracked American service members through their military careers. The question of how someone could be buried in a national cemetery with military honors if no records existed documenting their service led David to examine Mountain Home's burial authorization procedures during the World War II period, discovering that the cemetery had processed thousands of interments during the war years, and immediately afterward when remains were being repatriated from overseas, creating enormous administrative pressures that sometimes resulted in burials being authorized based on less comprehensive verification than peacetime procedures would have required. Cemetery administrators during the 1940s had relied primarily on military identification tags and on War Department notifications to authorize burials, assuming that if official military channels were certifying someone as a deceased veteran, then the underlying service documentation must exist even if the cemetery itself didn't maintain copies in its files. Creating opportunities for irregular burials to be processed through official systems, if someone with appropriate authority provided the necessary certifications, regardless of whether comprehensive service records actually supported those certifications. This relaxed verification created vulnerability to deliberate manipulation. If military authorities wanted to provide burial honors to individuals whose service existed outside normal documentation channels, allowing African American soldiers who had served in irregular capacities to receive recognition through burial, that official record systems might not reflect, because their service had been organized in ways that deliberately avoided creating the kind of comprehensive documentation that would make their contributions visible in archives that civil rights organizations might later use to support arguments about Black military performance and about African Americans' entitlement to equal treatment in recognition of their wartime sacrifices. The possibility that Samuel Patterson and the 17 other African American soldiers buried at Mountain Home without corresponding service records represented a deliberate program of providing burial honors while maintaining official silence about their actual military service suggested sophisticated understanding of how documentation systems could be selectively deployed to achieve contradictory goals of recognizing Black contributions while limiting how that recognition might be leveraged for political purposes in post-war civil rights struggles. David's research into the 92nd Infantry Division's actual operations in Italy during 1944 and 1945 revealed a complex history that had been heavily contested by historians trying to evaluate the unit's performance and to understand why it had struggled in some operations while performing effectively in others. With debates continuing decades after the war about whether the division's mixed combat record reflected inherent problems with using African American soldiers in frontline infantry roles, or whether it demonstrated the devastating effects of inadequate training, poor leadership, and the psychological burden of fighting while facing discrimination that extended into the military itself, and that made Black soldiers question whether the country they were defending deserved their sacrifice. The division had suffered heavy casualties during the Italian campaign, with more than 3,000 men killed or wounded while fighting in the Apennine Mountains during the winter of 1944-1945, suggesting that if Samuel Patterson had served with the unit during that period, he would have experienced intense combat that could plausibly have resulted in his death under the circumstances that family memory described. Yet the absence of Samuel's name from official casualty lists and unit rosters suggested either that family memory had incorrectly identified which unit he served with, or alternatively that his service with the 92nd Division had been irregular in ways that didn't generate normal personnel documentation, perhaps involving temporary assignments or specialized roles that existed outside the formal organizational structure that official records preserved in unit histories and personnel rosters. The Army had occasionally deployed African American soldiers in unofficial capacities when it needed their labor or skills, but didn't want to formally acknowledge their presence in roles that segregationist policies theoretically prohibited them from occupying, creating shadow formations that performed essential functions, while remaining invisible in official documentation that might later be used to support arguments about black capabilities and about the feasibility of military integration. The investigation took a significant turn when David discovered a small notation in Mountain Home Cemetery's burial records indicating that Samuel Patterson's interment in January 1945 had been requested by someone identified only as CPT J. Morrison, QM Corps, suggesting that a Quartermaster Corps captain had authorized the burial rather than it being processed through Samuel's own unit chain of command, as would normally occur when a soldier's remains were being returned from overseas for burial in his home community. The Quartermaster Corps handled logistics including graves registration and casualty processing, making it plausible that a quartermaster officer would be involved in arranging burial for returned remains. But the lack of additional detail about which specific quartermaster unit Captain Morrison belonged to, or what his relationship to Samuel Patterson might have been created, questions about why the burial authorization came through these particular channels rather than through the 92nd Infantry Division, if Samuel had indeed served with that unit as his uniform and family memory suggested. David's search for information about Captain J. Morrison in Quartermaster Corps records from the relevant period revealed multiple officers with that surname serving in various quartermaster units during World War II, but none whose service records indicated involvement with processing casualties from the 92nd Infantry Division, or who had any documented connection to Johnson City or to Washington County, Tennessee. That would explain why this particular officer would have taken personal interest in ensuring Samuel Patterson received appropriate burial in his home community. The most promising candidate was Captain James Morrison, who had served with a segregated quartermaster unit responsible for graves registration operations in the European theater during 1944 and 1945. But Morrison's personnel file contained no references to Samuel Patterson, or to any irregular burial authorizations that might explain his involvement in processing remains that official records didn't show as belonging to a documented service member. The possibility that Captain Morrison had been processing remains for African American soldiers whose service existed outside normal documentation channels suggested a broader program that might have involved dozens or hundreds of black service members whose wartime contributions were recognized through burial honors, while being systematically excluded from official personnel records that would have documented their military service in ways that could support benefits claims or that could be used as evidence in post-war civil rights arguments about black military performance and about African Americans' entitlement to equal treatment. This interpretation aligned with documentary evidence from other sources indicating that military authorities during World War II had sometimes organized African American service in ways that deliberately minimized official documentation, particularly when black soldiers were being deployed in combat roles that segregationist policies theoretically prohibited, or when their performance might generate evidence undermining racist assumptions about black military capabilities. David's examination of Johnson City's African American community during the World War II period revealed a small but resilient population that had maintained presence in East Tennessee despite the region's overwhelmingly white demographics, and despite systematic efforts to exclude African Americans from economic opportunities and social institutions that might have enabled them to establish permanent roots in communities where white residents often viewed any black presence as unwanted intrusion. The community had produced several young men who volunteered for military service during the war. seeing it as opportunity to escape the limited prospects available in Johnson City, and as chance to demonstrate patriotism and capability that might help advance civil rights causes, even though they had no illusions about the discrimination they would face within the segregated military itself. Family members who had known these volunteers described them leaving with pride and determination, despite knowing they would face racism from white officers and would be relegated to segregated units that received inadequate support, believing that their sacrifice mattered regardless of how the military treated them, and that their service would eventually contribute to breaking down the barriers that constrained African American life in Tennessee and throughout the South. Several of these volunteers had never returned to Johnson City, with families receiving notification that their sons or brothers or husbands had been killed in combat or had died from disease or accidents during their military service. Yet when David attempted to locate official documentation about these deaths, he discovered the same pattern of missing records that characterized Samuel Patterson's case, with graves existing in Mountain Home Cemetery bearing government headstones identifying the deceased as military veterans but with no corresponding personnel files or service documentation existing in the archives that should have preserved comprehensive records about their enlistment, training, deployment, and the circumstances of their deaths. The pattern suggested that multiple African American volunteers from Johnson City had served in capacities that generated burial honors, but not official documentation, raising questions about what exactly these men had done during their time in uniform, and why military authorities had chosen to recognize their service through burial, while denying them the comprehensive record-keeping that would have preserved evidence of their contributions in forms that might later support benefits claims or civil rights arguments. The most disturbing possibility was that these men had been deployed in particularly dangerous assignments that military leadership didn't want officially documented because the casualty rates or the nature of the missions might generate political controversy if the public understood how African American soldiers were being used, with burial honors serving as compensation for families whose grief and pride in their loved one's sacrifice would be satisfied by military funerals, even without the comprehensive documentation that white families would have demanded and received when their sons died in military service. This interpretation suggested that the military had developed a two-tier system where white casualties received full documentation that honored their service and supported benefits for survivors, while black casualties received burial recognition but minimal official record-keeping, creating a deliberate gap in archives that would make it difficult for future researchers to fully document African American military contributions or for civil rights organizations to marshal evidence about black military performance during arguments about integration and equal treatment. David's investigation eventually connected with other researchers who had discovered similar patterns of African American World War II veterans buried in national cemeteries without corresponding military service records, suggesting a nationwide phenomenon rather than a problem specific to Mountain Home or to Tennessee. With hundreds or possibly thousands of black service members whose wartime experiences remained undocumented in official archives, despite their graves bearing government headstones that acknowledged them as veterans who had died in their country's service. The researchers had formed an informal network attempting to reconstruct African American military history by piecing together fragments of evidence from family memories, preserved artifacts, and the physical reality of graves that confirmed service even when personnel files didn't exist, working to recover stories that official military history had erased or minimized through documentation practices that systematically underrepresented black contributions to American military operations across multiple wars and conflicts. The network's collective research suggested that the absence of records for African American service members reflected deliberate policy decisions at multiple levels of military bureaucracy, with some documentation gaps resulting from segregated record-keeping systems that maintained lower standards for black personnel files than for white service members, and with other gaps reflecting conscious choices to avoid documenting African American military performance in ways that might undermine segregationist arguments or that might generate evidence supporting integration and equal treatment during the post-war period, when civil rights organizations were beginning to challenge Jim Crow's legal foundations, using arguments that included references to black military service and sacrifice that supposedly earned African Americans the right to equal citizenship in the democracy they had defended against fascism abroad. The military's institutional investment in maintaining segregation meant that comprehensive documentation of black military contributions posed ideological threats that could be managed by simply not creating or preserving the records that would make those contributions visible in archives where future generations of historians and activists might discover them. The broader implications of this systematic documentation failure extended beyond individual injustice to the service members whose contributions went unrecorded, creating profound gaps in American military history that made it impossible to fully understand how the nation had mobilized for World War II, or how different populations had contributed to victory in ways that official records either minimized or entirely erased through documentation practices that served political purposes of maintaining racial hierarchies rather than historical purposes of accurately preserving evidence about who had served and what they had accomplished. The missing records ensured that African American military history during World War II would remain incomplete and contested, with researchers forced to rely on fragments and implications rather than on comprehensive documentation that would have existed if black service members had received the same careful record-keeping that white soldiers generated automatically through their participation in military operations. David's attempt to recover his great-uncle's story ultimately produced more questions than answers, establishing that Samuel Lewis Patterson had almost certainly served in some military capacity during World War II, given the physical evidence of his grave and uniform, and given family memories that were too detailed and consistent to be entirely fabricated, yet leaving unresolved exactly what he had done during his time in service, which unit he had actually been assigned to, despite the 92nd Division uniform preserved in the family's attic, where and how he had died if indeed he had been killed in combat as family notification had claimed, and why his service had been processed in ways that generated burial honors, but no official documentation that would have preserved his story for future generations, or that would have supported his family's claims for death benefits and recognition that should have accompanied military sacrifice. The gaps in documentation meant that Samuel's wartime experiences would remain forever partially unknown, reduced to fragments that confirmed service without explaining it, and that honored sacrifice without fully documenting it. The contemporary military showed limited interest in investigating why hundreds of African American World War II veterans lacked service records, despite having graves in national cemeteries, with officials suggesting that after 7 decades, the priority should be honoring all veteran service rather than questioning record-keeping practices from an earlier era, when different standards and procedures had governed military administration, effectively asking families to accept that their ancestors' contributions would remain officially unacknowledged, even though the government had provided burial recognition, suggesting those contributions deserved to be remembered and documented. This position prioritized institutional convenience over historical justice, treating the absence of records as unfortunate historical accident rather than as evidence of systematic discrimination that had denied African American service members the documentation that would have preserved their stories and supported their families' rightful claims for benefits and recognition that white families received automatically when their loved ones died in military service. The family uniform that David's grandmother had preserved across 7 decades remained the most tangible evidence of Samuel Patterson's military service, physical proof that he had worn his country's uniform regardless of what official records suggested about whether his service had been properly documented through channels that would have created personnel files and service documentation, and regardless of what questions remained about whether the specific uniform in the attic had actually been his service dress or had been acquired after the war to provide family with artifact they could hold and preserve as connection to a man whose sacrifice they wanted to honor even if official systems refused to adequately acknowledge his contributions. The uniform's authenticity mattered less than what it represented to the family, serving as memorial to service and sacrifice that deserved recognition, whether or not bureaucratic systems had bothered to create the paperwork that would have made Samuel Patterson visible in military archives where future researchers might discover evidence of what he had done during the years when he was away from Johnson City wearing his country's uniform and ultimately dying in that service. What remains is Samuel Lewis Patterson's grave in Mountain Home National Cemetery, its government headstone marking him as a World War II veteran who died in 1944, surrounded by hundreds of other markers documenting men who served and died during the same conflict, his burial processed through official military channels that acknowledged him as entitled to the honors that national cemetery interment represented. Even though no service records exist to document what he did to earn that recognition, or to preserve his story for future generations, who might want to understand how their ancestor contributed to defeating fascism during the largest war in human history, the grave stands as physical evidence that Samuel Patterson's service mattered enough for the government to provide military burial. Yet official silence about the specifics of that service ensures that his actual wartime experiences will remain forever partially unknown, reduced to fragments of family memory and physical artifacts that confirm he served without explaining exactly how, or where, or under what circumstances, beyond the basic fact that he wore uniform and that he died while doing so. The impossible soldier exists in the space between documented presence through his grave and official absence from military records, marking both individual sacrifice that deserves recognition and systematic institutional failure that denied African American service members the comprehensive documentation their contributions warranted, leaving families with graves to visit and memories to preserve, but without the official acknowledgement that would have fully honored service and sacrifice that helped defeat enemies abroad, while the country that benefited from that sacrifice continued denying equal treatment at home to the people whose military contributions should have earned them full citizenship rights regardless of their race. Samuel Patterson served and died. His grave confirms that much, but what exactly he did and why it went undocumented remains mystery that reflects how thoroughly American military institutions during the segregation era were committed to limiting how much credit African American service members received for their contributions, ensuring that even in death, Black soldiers would be recognized just enough to satisfy families' grief while being denied the comprehensive documentation that might later support arguments about their capabilities and about their entitlement to equal treatment in recognition of their sacrifice. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next investigation into American military history, where graves confirm service that official records systematically erased, leaving researchers to recover truths that institutions worked deliberately to hide, because acknowledging African American contributions might have challenged the racial hierarchies that segregation required everyone to maintain, regardless of what Black military performance demonstrated about capabilities that racist ideology claimed didn't exist.